Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all who are joining our webinar today, developed in collaboration by ICLEI Local Governments for Sustainability, New York City Mayor's Office for International Affairs and Local 2030, as a part of the City Resilience Stories webinar series of ICLEI's Resilient Development Pathway team. My name is Yunus Arikan. I'm the Director of Global Advocacy at ICLEI World Secretariat in Bonn. Today, in the next 1 hour, we will have a lively debate on the subnational leadership in the recovery process, in particularly connecting to the sustainability and climate agenda. So we will have two sets of interventions. So first one will be our keynote speakers and panelists. We will have a welcome remark by Penny Abeywardena from New York City Mayor's Office, and she's the Commissioner of the Mayor's Office for International Affairs of New York City. We will then follow with three panelists: Aissata Camara, the Deputy Commissioner for New York City; Kerry Constabile, Team Lead for Sustainable Development Unit in Executive Office of the UN Secretary General. And we will have the closing remark of our panelists with Shipra Narang Suri, the Chief of the Urban Practices Branch at UN Habitat. I just would like to remind that all attendees are in a listening only mode, that you would not be heard, you will only hear the speakers and the panelists, but during the presentation, you may have the chance to respond or type your questions. And in the question and answer session, we will start with the three sets of initial interventions, initial respondents. This includes an intervention from City of Bonn, Stefan Wagner, Head of International Relations and Global Sustainability, Manuel Araujo, Mayor of Quelimane from Mozambique, and he's also the Global Executive Committee member of ICLEI Local Governments for Sustainability. And we will also have Megan Spires, a Senior Manager of Climate Change and Energy and Resilience at ICLEI Africa Secretariat. So as you can see, we have a diversity of regions, expertise, technical and political leaders. Particularly, we're strong in women leadership. I was following all the debates on the corona that the cities and the countries who were led by women were supposed to be much more powerful. And I think this would be one of those proof in our session. Before I give the floor to Penny, without further ado, I also would like to recall that we are having seriously difficult and challenging times. And on behalf of ICLEI, I first would like to thank all our partners in sharing this session with us. But I also would like to share our condolences with all those who lost their lives and their families. And we'd like to particularly commend our members, cities and regional governments all around the world who are helping us to cope with these challenges, especially spending their days and nights in serving our cities and citizens. So we are appreciating all their efforts. And without further ado, I'd like to invite you. It's a particular pleasure for us to have Penny joining us. She's in fact the locomotive, brain and heart of sustainability of New York City. So Penny, we are delighted to have your keynote remarks. We know you have limited time, but we are honored and extremely happy to hear your joining us. So the floor is yours, Penny.
Thank you, Yunus, and thank you to ICLEI. This partnership that we have with you has been really important, and we appreciate this opportunity to collaborate today. Can everybody hear me? We're good? Okay, excellent.
Yes.
Thank you. I am joined today by Aissata Camara, who's our Deputy Commissioner for Operations and Strategic Partnerships. And again, it is wonderful to join this extremely wonderful speaker panel. I see Kerry and many other partners that we've had over the years. First, I'm just going to set the stage right now. New York City is the epicenter of the crisis in the U.S. Tested, we have more than 150,000 confirmed COVID-19 cases and more than 11,000 deaths. Just to give you some context in terms of where we are, in terms of dates, it was on March 16th that we closed in New York City public schools, which impacted over 1 million youth around our 5 boroughs. On March 17th, the mayor made the suggestion to New Yorkers that a shelter-in-place order was coming within a few days. And then on March 20th, Governor Cuomo instituted what we call Pawza here in New York State, which is essentially shelter in place. If anybody is paying attention to the news right now, you're going to be very aware that local leadership in terms of mayors and governors and regional cooperation has been extremely important in how we've tackled this pandemic of COVID-19. We started with an aggressive containment phase, which included contact tracing and testing. But again, because of a disconnect with our federal government and a lack of quick approvals for testing kits and enough supply of the testing kits, we had to transition into what we call the mitigation phase, which has really been what we have been managing over the last few weeks. This is essentially recognizing that most people have interacted with somebody with COVID-19. So if you are sick, our advice to you is to stay at home if you are not extremely ill, and to self-isolate. We have seen our hospital system become extremely overwhelmed. We've had to triple the number of available hospital beds from 20,000 to 60,000, which has included creating field hospitals in Central Park, the Jacob Javits Conference Center, a tennis center in Queens. So we've increased that. We are actively seeking enough PPE and ventilators. That was a real challenge in the early days, is ensuring that New York City had enough of that. And now the mayor is really building out capacity around contact tracing. There is some good news. Excuse me, I hear somebody talking at the same time, and it's a little bit difficult for me to talk. Sorry, thank you. We have seen the number of our positive cases slowing down, and we have been really focused on not only managing the crisis as it is happening, but also our next step and the recovering and building back better and stronger. The mayor has spoken very strongly about the fact that we are in this situation and we need to build back in a way that transforms our society for the better. We have seen our structural racism and inequities really being highlighted in this crisis in terms of who is dying throughout our 5 boroughs and the impact on our brown and Black communities. New York City is also getting ready, in New York State, for the reality of a budget crisis. We, at this point, have moved U.S. tax collection to the middle of summer, but obviously with the majority of our businesses, retail closed, we are going to be really struggling in the next couple of months, couple of years with a budget crisis. So what the mayor has decided we need to focus on, both right now, but also in rebuilding, is to ensure that our people are healthy, safe, have enough food to eat, and a roof over their heads. We are down to the basics, but this is a priority for this administration and our 8.6 million residents of our five boroughs. We are tracking 3 main indicators, which will lead to our recovery, which is really going to activate our recovery status and process. The CDC is recommending that we need to see this for at least 14 days, and that is a decrease in people admitted to the hospital with suspected COVID-19, people admitted to our health and hospitals ICU beds with suspected COVID-19, and the percentage of people tested who are positive with COVID-19. We need to see those significantly decrease, and that needs to be consistent over a 14-day period before we engage in a recovery status or a strategy. What we are currently doing in terms of recovery plan is we're creating task force and advisory councils based on sector. And I think this is important to highlight because this really shows the areas in which we know that we need to prioritize. It's everything from arts, culture, and tourism to our nonprofit and social services, our faith-based communities, of course, our small and large businesses. But this is a group of some of the best minds on these topics that are coming together to advise the city. So it's really tapping into the brilliance that is throughout our community here, to address questions that range from how do we reopen a restaurant in ways that protect customers and workers, what kind of social distancing will be required, but we also need to talk about how we are addressing the structural racism that we are seeing in the disparities in the COVID-19 deaths. One statistic I want to share with you is that 34% of deaths in New York City are among Latino residents, even though that community only makes up 29% of the population. So there is an opportunity that we want to be able to take, that as we build back, we are going to make it transformative to ensure that our most vulnerable are taken care of and have a stronger voice in our recovery efforts. So this is just a quick summation of what we've been doing and the connection to, right now, the mayor and the governor believe so strongly in global cooperation, in how we are connecting best practices beyond borders. It is time to really accelerate the impact in our community. And we have, over the last 5 years, really been doing that through the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals, whether it has been around New York City's priorities to guarantee healthcare and insurance for all, guaranteeing a minimum wage of $15, paid sick leave, paid parental leave. It is about exchanging these sorts of best practices. And this is also relevant to COVID-19, but this is that framework that is the fundamental to our Global Vision Urban Action programming and the voluntary local review movement that we have been helping to lead. But COVID-19 does not take us away from these priorities. They're going to become, at the end of the day, core to the way that we build back and that we transform our community to ensure that our most vulnerable are in a stronger position. So that is I'm going to conclude there. Aissata is going to give a deeper presentation on our Global Vision Urban Action and our voluntary local review movement, but we're very happy to answer any questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Penny. That was really a very essential and holistic presentation of the situation where we are, where you are. I think what you have gone through is similar to many of the cities around the world. It started with a health crisis, then it turned into a resilience or emergency management. But then the more we are entering into the recovery phase, it's a sustainability management and sustainability vision. And having New York City in the heart of all these leadership, and be it voluntary local reviews, be it climate ambition, or resilience throughout the city, across society, and in an inclusive way, I think that is the moment where we will test how these previous efforts have helped you, and how you can learn from your experiences of today to build tomorrow in a much more sustainable way. So we would like to express our heartfelt success stories to you, and best of efforts that you can manage your city much better than you have been needing, so that you can be offering your citizens a better future, and build the trust in their leadership, in their staff, in their neighborhoods. In that sense, I think this is the biggest asset we all have, is this collaborative across neighborhoods, across departments, and across the world, this like-minded colleagues. So we know you have a heavy agenda. Your citizens are looking forward to your leadership, so we do not want to keep you so long, but we have the pleasure to have Aissata joining you to go to the details. Once again, thanks a lot for your efforts and your leadership, and we are delighted to collaborate further.
And Yunus, thank you so much for your partnership. The ICLEI platform has been incredibly important for us, and we're really looking forward to leaning on it as we move forward. So thank you.
Pleasure, Penny. Thanks a lot. So without further ado, Aissata, let's continue in the sense that I mentioned in the last couple of seconds to Penny. Let's go through the details about, in the sense that you were one of those champions for a long time, being front runners on voluntary local reviews, the climate ambition in both mitigation and adaptation, as well as resilience. So can you share with us how this existing preparedness helped you to respond to COVID? And maybe afterwards, how do you wish to let's say, position these existing strategies in your efforts to build back better with your lessons learned? That is really a unique moment in history. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Eunice, for the kind introduction and for really helping to set the stage here. But before I go into details, I want to thank everyone at ICLEI for bringing us together. And it's wonderful to be here with our colleagues from other local governments, Local 2030 and UN Habitat. I'll echo Penny's comments about the challenging times that we're facing and the inequities that this virus is highlighting worldwide. In times like this, it's important that we continue to come together to share best practices and knowledge in order to build a clear roadmap that will help our communities through this crisis and beyond. However, as Mayor de Blasio said in one of his recent press conferences, we cannot thrive to rebuild back to the status quo because the standards that were being used then left many people behind. Instead, we must strive to rebuild with strong equity, sustainability, and inclusion lenses. As in office, our goal since Commissioner Abeywardena was appointed in 2014 has been to build strong connections between our local colleagues and their international counterparts. Connections we knew will help both sides in better serving their constituents. And to do this, we facilitated delegation visits and hosted thematic events. However, in April 2015, as some of you may know, our city developed its own strategy for a fairer, more inclusive and resilient city, and it was called One NYC. In September of that same year, the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted by the United Nations member states. And we found these moments to be pivotal in highlighting the connections between global efforts and local actions. So we created a platform called Global Vision Urban Action to explore this nexus. Particularly, we mapped our One NYC strategy to the SDGs and developed a booklet that could be used by local and international colleagues to understand ways our local work fits into the broader global effort. We also continue to organize site visits to key New York City locations, including our local ports and sanitation processing centers. And this work evolved once more in 2018 when we decided to create the Voluntary Local Review, a report submitted directly to the United Nations in which we discuss our city's progress toward achieving the SDGs. And this work was welcomed by local governments worldwide and by member states and the UN leadership. The Voluntary Local Review is a tool to help local governments understand ways their work aligns with the SDGs. It is also a tool to help them engage relevant stakeholders in their communities around the SDGs and to identify efficiencies to better serve their constituents. In 2019, we had numerous local governments, including Helsinki and Bristol, that joined us in submitting their reports during the UN's high-level political forum. And in September of that same year, we unveiled the Voluntary Local Review Declaration during the United Nations General Assembly as a way of formalizing local governments' commitments to the SDGs. The declaration contains three key commitments that align with the work that I mentioned earlier. The first commitment is to identify how existing strategies, programs, data, and targets align with the Sustainable Development Goals. And the second commitment is to provide at least one forum where stakeholders can come together to share experiences, lessons learned, and information gathered using the framework of the SDGs. And finally, the third commitment that is part of the declaration is to submit a voluntary local review to the United Nations during the high-level political forum. We were intentional in building flexibilities in these commitments so that local governments can start where they are using resources they possess. This ensures a low barrier for entry so that local governments of all types and resources can connect around common goals. We now have local governments representing nearly every continent committed to this movement. But when we were talking about starting where you are, None of us could have imagined the challenges created by COVID-19. In times like this, it's easy to want to retreat and focus on the immediate challenges, but we cannot do that. We must not do that. We have to rebuild stronger and better. And the VLR process and the SDGs are strong tools in our toolbox. I'd like to provide an example of our work on climate as a way of understanding how we can rebuild better. It's become even more imperative for local sorry? Oh, was someone talking? I'm so sorry. Someone said someone is muted.
Go ahead.
Okay,
Go ahead.
I will.
Aissata, you can continue. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so as I was saying, I'd like to provide the example on our climate work. So fighting the climate crisis has to be at the heart of our recovery planning because climate change is a threat multiplier. Mayor Bill de Blasio included climate and environmental justice as key components of his recently announced COVID-19 Fair Recovery for All plan. As mentioned, we already have experience in putting equity at the center of our ambitious climate actions in New York City. One NYC and in the new One NYC 2050, also known as the Green New Deal, both reflect the idea of equity. And in these strategies, the new One NYC 2050 strategy, the city has committed to producing and submitting a voluntary local review to the United Nations every year. Again, by sharing our progress with the world and linking local action to the Sustainable Development Goals, we hope to empower more cities to join the movement toward creating a livable future for the next generation. And in closing, I want to highlight the fact that our team is fortunate to speak to at least 2 local governments each week. And I want to acknowledge the challenges we are all facing. For some, they are currently in a place where they are backed against the wall, a place where they can't imagine being able to continue to work on the SDGs. However, each conversation ends the same way. We help them understand that now is the time to use the roadmap of the SDGs. Now is the moment to align their strategies to the global goals. If you are dealing, for example, with issues of hunger as a result of COVID-19, you should look at SDG 2 and the targets for ending hunger. And if you are dealing with inequities in access to health, look at SDG 3 and focus on good health and well-being. And as a result of this, we call on all local governments to persevere and to continue this work. We call on you to join the voluntary local review movement, where you'll be able to access knowledge and to just be able to talk to other local governments. But moreover, we call on everyone to put equity, sustainability, and inclusion at the center of the work to rebuild post-COVID-19. My colleagues and I are available to have conversations with local governments as needed. I want to thank each of you for your kind attention and to thank the organizers and colleagues again for their dedication in putting this event together. Once again, COVID-19 has presented unprecedented challenges, but together as local governments, we can surmount these challenges, and we can do it by using the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Aissata. I think, as Penny mentioned at the beginning, New York City is one of the biggest epicenters of the crisis, and this means that you are facing one of the biggest challenges. But even in this hardest conditions, you are not giving up with your commitments to sustainable development goals and climate action. I think this is a very strong signal that, as a famous song says, that if you can make it in New York, you can make it everywhere, even in the worst times. That you are saying that your powerhouse, your lighthouse is sustainability.
Yes.
I think that is an important message, that what we have been working for so many years is not a waste of effort. or it was not for nothing, that is now paying off. As particularly in a country where you are facing several challenges at the multi-level level, that I think is important to make sure that all local leaders should be keeping this as a lessons learned, and we look forward to sharing your success stories as well. I know I've seen some pragmatic questions or technical questions, but we will come back to this in the Q&A session. But maybe now we go to our next speaker, in the sense that yes, we are dealing with this on the front lines as cities, but the world is also united more than ever, and the champion of this multilateral process is, of course, the United Nations. We have been actually working very closely over these years, and Kerry has always been a very strong colleague of us in the Secretary General's office, starting from the UN Climate Action Summit, and now she is also a conveyor to us the proposals, the messages, and opportunities through the UN system, how cities and regions worldwide could be empowered and motivated further, that their path towards sustainability is even stronger. Kerry, how would you like to share the latest updates from UN Secretary General's initiatives? Thank you for joining us.
Great, thank you so much, Yunus, colleagues. It's wonderful to see you, Yunus, and all of your colleagues at ICLEI, longtime collaborators, and Penny and Aissata. It's just such a pleasure. We work very closely, and you know, it is really an honor to be here with colleagues from you know, the front lines, and as a born and raised New Yorker, now you know, long time with the United Nations, I just want to thank New York for everything that it has done, for response, for supporting small businesses, etc. Not etc., but there's so much to say, so thank you. I'm just going to share my screen right now. Hopefully everyone is able to see it. And I just want to first present a little bit about what the Secretary General has issued in terms of the overarching framework for COVID response and recovery. As we all know, this is the greatest crisis that the world has faced since World War II, and the UN has been at the forefront of response, of the health response, of the economic response, working and to support governments at all levels to do as much as possible as during this time of need. The Secretary General in the very beginning of the crisis issued a report in March titled Shared Responsibility, Global Solidarity, Responding to the Socioeconomic Impacts of COVID-19. In the report, the Secretary General calls on everyone in the world to act together to address this impact and lessen the blow to people at all levels, and especially the most vulnerable. The report outlines 3 key asks, and I'm just going to give you an overview of those asks in order to best frame the Recover Better strategy, or the initial thinking around Recover Better. Firstly, the global community must mount the most robust and cooperative health response the world has ever seen. Secondly, that the global community does everything possible to cushion the knock-on effects on millions of people's lives, their livelihoods, and the real economy, with a particular focus on the most vulnerable. And thirdly, that we learn from this crisis, and as Penny and Aissata articulated so well, that we build back better, that we do not get back to the status quo. So the UN and its global network with the private sector, with national governments, with local governments, will work as around the clock to implement the actions that are aligned with these 3 asks. And we're particularly focused right now on working with the very significant footprint that the UN has, with resident coordinators, country teams, peacekeeping missions, political missions, on policy and on operational delivery, from food to health to procurement of supplies, everything that is needed, both at national and local level. The report, we were very pleased as a community that is very committed to local government action, that the report specifically highlights the importance of local governments and their partners in preparing for, responding to, and recovering from this crisis. In many, if anyone, hoping that everyone has been following the Secretary General's messages, he is he's working very closely with local governments at all levels. He's working very closely with New York, of course, at the epicenter of the crisis in this country, and as the host of the UN, in strong collaboration, recognizing that local governments are on the front line and are the front line of response, but will be on the front line of recovery. The report and the Secretary General has acknowledged that local governments can play an important role in all three asks, from response to protecting the most vulnerable to recovery. Working on immediate healthcare response, addressing socioeconomic impacts, for example, supporting local businesses, small businesses, which we've seen in New York, we've seen in Lagos, etc. And working on recovering better. For example, through aligning with voluntary local reviews, exploring how to make temporary sustainable transport changes more of regular policy. We're seeing some temporary changes in transport that can become permanent. And the report also acknowledges the ability of local governments to engage in such efforts depends on their budgetary authority and their governance context. So against this background, whole of society approaches and effective coordination between local and national governments are crucial. In addition, finding mechanisms that will provide more financing to local governments is of utmost importance, and it is something that we have been working on strongly from the UN. I'm just going to quickly outline two more important points on Recover Better. In the context of Recover Better, some colleagues may have seen a lot of the articles over the last week since Earth Day last week, and the op-ed in the New York Times yesterday, where the Secretary General outlined 6 climate positive actions that are needed to recover better. The Secretary General has been quite concerned about rollbacks in environmental and climate policy that some governments have justified based on the current COVID crisis. This is entirely the wrong approach to roll back climate and environmental policies and ambitions. We must focus on recovering from this crisis more sustainably rather than renegating prior commitments. Due to time constraints, I won't go through all of the 6 principles, but you all can see these on your slide. I urge you to consider them at the local level, to translate them into what they mean in your contexts, and to communicate back to us how you think that our office, from the Secretary General's vantage point, from the UN system, can provide more support to local governments to implement as much climate positive action as possible, and use this recovery phase to support green jobs and sustainable growth, and refrain from financially supporting polluting industries. Lastly, I'll bring in Local 2030, which my colleague Shipra from UN Habitat will be building off of. Local 2030 is a UN-wide platform that very closely collaborates with New York City, with ICLEI, with United Cities and Local Governments, C40, as well as International Chamber of Commerce, etc., to work at the local level and to develop enabling environments so that local communities can align with the SDGs, have the tools to implement SDG aligned budgets, plans, projects, and really as a global community, as Aissata mentioned, really working with a global vision and getting as local as possible, prioritizing community leadership and shining a light on leadership that sometimes is not seen at this global level. This year, I mean, as with every year, we have an event that aggregates the solutions that all of you on this call are leading, which is focused on local action for global commitments. This is at the high-level political forum. I apologize, we sometimes in the UN put acronyms in and they don't make sense to the rest of the world. But so the HLPF on the screen is called the High-Level Political Forum and takes place in July. Generally, we will have this as an in-person gathering. We may still have it in person or it may be virtual. But just for everyone to know on this call that this year will be focused on recovering better at the local level. Climate positive action will be of central importance for this event. And if we do have it virtually, perhaps that will enable us to even have a broader level of engagement and collaboration around the world on what solutions are working in recovery, what voluntary local reviews, how volunteer VLRs can contribute to the recovery and shape a new world after this difficult time. Thank you.
Thank you, Kerry. Thank you. I think from all local and regional governments worldwide, we are really feeling ourselves privileged to have such a leadership in the UN Secretary General's office that is close and opening the doors wide open for us to collaborate with the UN system. I'm receiving a lot of questions. Just to recall, this webinar is recorded and it will be available. And we will also view the slides also downloadable. I'm receiving questions already like the funding resources from the UN. I'm sure Penny will also talk about, sorry, Aissata will also talk about some technical issues like transport that is coming up, or the UN Solidarity Fund that SG has created, but maybe can come this on the QA session. Or we also would like to encourage all the participants to type their questions so that we can communicate the speakers later on. So I'd like to get to our last speaker, Shipra, a long friend of ICLEI and personally me. I'm delighted to have you and welcome you in this session. In the UN system, we are a great family, and there are a lot of sisters, brothers, and UN Habitat, of course, is the closest to local and regional governments. You're also sharing the local 2030 with the UN Secretary General's office, and especially with Habitat 3, which you played a lot of role in terms of achieving the success personally and institutionally. Habitat 3 gave a huge mandate now to UN Habitat, and in the aftermath, UN Habitat also successfully went through repositioning its strategy. We have a fantastic leader, Maimuna Sharif, one of the leaders of ICLEI as well. So we are showing much more relevance of UN Habitat to local and regional governments, but the global community that sustainable urban development can be a partner in sustainable efforts, and also including this disaster. So how can you highlight UN Habitat's efforts in this process, and we are delighted to have you joining us and also partnering with this process with you.
Thank you, Yunus, for the invitation and for the kind words. And it's really an honor to be sharing this webinar and this platform with so many people we've collaborated with and worked with and been partners in crime with, so to speak, for many years. And ICLEI is definitely one of them. So thank you again. Indeed, UN Habitat is the agency responsible in the UN system for sustainable urbanization. We have a mandate to look at cities and human settlements and how they can be made more safe, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable. And this crisis has really brought into very sharp relief the issues of social and spatial inequity that are at the heart of UN Habitat's mandate. As Penny highlighted, as Aissata said, and as the Secretary General has been saying, the most vulnerable to the impacts of the pandemic are those that are already at the fringes of society, that are living and working in overcrowded conditions, in informality, without access to water, to sanitation, to basic services, to safe transport, to electricity, or to stable livelihoods, or even to safe public space. UN Habitat has a special focus of its work on the people who live in slums and informal settlements, 1 billion approximately at this time. But then there are also many, many others who live in inadequate housing, in overcrowded conditions, or who are homeless. And that number then extends to much bigger. There are also 2.4 billion people in this world who lack access to adequate water and sanitation. These are the people who cannot practice the measures that are being promoted to prevent the spread of COVID. But these are also the people who have very, very few means to help them bounce back. The sort of resilience, economic, social resilience that we hope societies and communities would have. So the underlying vulnerabilities and the underlying weaknesses are very sharply exacerbated and articulated by this pandemic. It is therefore fundamentally important. I'm glad Penny said it. I'm glad this is being strongly championed by the SG, that COVID response and recovery, first of all, these efforts do no harm. And I think we must remember that we consciously prevent any backsliding, the rollback that Kerry just talked about, on progress made on the SDGs, on Paris, and on other international development goals. And this is, the possibilities of regression are very real. If you've been following the discourse around, how the pandemic spread, some of the discourse that talks about or that advocates low density development, what we as planners would immediately start calling sprawl, or that encourages private transport and discourages the use of public transport, or that blames somehow informal markets or informal livelihoods or the poor or certain communities, or pushes back against migrants. All of this discourse can be very damaging and can take us very, very far back from the progress we've made on our development goals and on our aim of leaving no one behind. So that's first, that we do no harm and we prevent this kind of backsliding. And the second is, of course, what Kerry just mentioned, that we open up opportunities for a more inclusive and more resilient future. So focusing on these dimensions, UN Habitat launched its COVID response plan last week, focusing on 64 countries and on city level response to crisis. As you just said, Yunus, and Kerry also mentioned, UN Habitat is the agency within the UN system that works most closely with local and regional governments, subnational governments, and our response definitely has to focus on communities and on local governments at its very heart. Of course, we are working with WHO on the health response. We're also very much engaged with the IASC and the Global Humanitarian Response Plan on the humanitarian response. But it is really the socio-economic response, which is at the focus on recovering better, and the focus on doing things better in the future, planning better, preventing such crises in the future, is really at the essence of our work. So just very quickly, 3 major response areas within that plan. First is to support local governments and community-driven solutions in informal settlements. That is fundamental. If the pandemic starts to spread in informal settlements, first of all, that already will be a catastrophe. And second, the socioeconomic impact, the knock-on effects, the spin-off effects on livelihoods, on hunger, on food security, and on many generations to come are huge. So working with the most vulnerable urban poor in informal settlements is the first part, and working with local governments and poor communities hand in hand. The second part is to provide urban data and evidence and mapping and knowledge. Very often we do not have spatially disaggregated data to see who is affected most. Where should local governments put their efforts? Where should they put their their money. Who should they focus on first? So providing that evidence and providing that database and that knowledge and working with local governments to build that knowledge is the second part of our response plan. And the third, of course, is to mitigate the economic impact and initiate recovery, which is diverse, which is inclusive, and which is green. So that's very, very important. That's very central to the response plan that UN Habitat has put together. I also want to flag a couple of quick things. One, the work that we're doing also with various local government networks here, of course with you, Yunus, and ICLEI, but also the Global Task Force, the United Cities and Local Governments, the live learning events that we're running with them, which really are meant to share experiences as the pandemic is still not peaked, is still there. So it's really, that's why it's called live learning. The second, Kerry mentioned Local 2030. So under the umbrella of Local 2030, there is a new campaign which is launched, which is called the Spotlight Series on COVID-19, which is to amplify the voices of those who are at the front lines of battling the pandemic, their experiences, their solutions, their innovations, and we're encouraging people to join with a new theme every couple of weeks. We're also repurposing our existing programs. This is very important, and if anyone, for those who are working on the front lines in international development, UN agencies and others, we need to start repurposing existing money, existing grants. New money is difficult. Secretary General's report also talks about repurposing our existing funding, our existing projects, so that no one is left behind and so that we can recover better. I'll leave it there, Yunus, for now. Thank you.
That was excellent, Shipra. From the environment community that personally and professionally that we're much more closer, there are discussions that this was a generation of a signal of the nature that for the first time in decades or so, emissions for the first time fell down. And maybe this was a signal that we're now in the last opportunity to correct our past mistakes
and our ways.
Exactly, and I think we have to go beyond piecemeal solutions so that by solving one problem, we don't create another one, but make a much holistic approach and starting with where you are living, starting redesigning the way you are building your cities and the existing one and the new ones could be a fantastic opportunity to also save our climate, save our health. And I think that's why UN Habitat's mission is much more important. And we're happy that UN Habitat is also getting stronger through this crisis so that the world's cities and regions and national governments are looking forward to you as a close partner. So we have 15 minutes left. This will be a challenge, but we have 3 respondents. I would like to underline that the selection of those respondents but also had a purpose. First of all, we want to have regional balance. We will first go to Europe. Europe is also one of the hardest regions, and we will be starting with City of Bonn. Stefan Wagner from International Relations Department, head of the department, will join us. Especially it makes sense because Bonn is another UN city, and just yesterday, Mayor of Bonn had joined the Petersburg dialogue in responding to how City of Bonn is continuing to climate leadership. And we'd like to hear from Stefan Wagner how the sustainability efforts, a multi-level collaboration, and climate and resilience could help each other to serve the citizens better and collectively, globally, serve the network. So Stefan, the floor is yours, and thanks a lot for joining us and also especially hosting ICLEI in your beautiful city of Bonn.
Thank you very much, Yunus, and thank everybody for giving me the opportunity to be briefly speaking and responding on these very interesting presentations we heard. A very nice greeting to my colleagues in New York City, Aissata and Penny. I came in a bit late, but I heard what I said, the presentation of Aissata very well, and I know what a hard time New York is facing at the moment. I want to be quite brief in my assessment of the meeting so far. We all have seen that the pandemic has shown how vulnerable we all are as highly industrialized countries, be it New York, be it United States or Europe, where we're facing this pandemic very heavily as well. This is why we need to rethink the way we as cities are organized ourselves and putting maybe a strong focus also in the future on urban resilience, on the need of digitalization in education, administrative services, and of course on social equity and inclusion, as was mentioned by previous speakers, which is very, very important. In fact, it seems to me that indeed those cities that have put a strong focus on sustainability in the past may be managing this current crisis better than others, and New York City is just a great example for that. And I also believe, and can only echo what Aissata said, that the 2030 agenda and the SDGs provide just a brilliant and very useful framework for more sustainably and socially just development in the future. And that also now, after this crisis, we have the opportunity to put more investments into green recovery and a smart infrastructure, I hope. So this is what we also do in Bonn with our we will continue our strong commitment to a sustainable path also in the future. We passed a sustainability strategy last year that is explicitly focusing on the SDGs. We announced a climate emergency last year by the City Council, and we also committed to climate neutrality by 2035 and work heavily on concepts to reach that ambitious goal. And we do not let COVID-19 prevent us from focusing on these activities. In this regard, I'm particularly glad to also announce that we will, for the first time as City of Bonn, bring and hand in a voluntary local review this year. We are just working on, and we will be very glad to become also part of the global voluntary local review movement initiated and handled by New York City. I know that we are a bit lacking of time, so I will leave it, Yunus, for the moment with this, and happy to answer any questions if there might be. So thank you very much indeed for listening.
Thank you, Stefan. It's congratulations also to City of Bonn advancing its progress on sustainability, and within a year it also have addressed both the new sustainable strategy, as you mentioned, climate emergency and climate neutral target, and now we are hearing from you that this will continue with the voluntary local review. This shows your collaboration and our commitment to sustainability. We will now go to Africa. Africa is also one of the most fastest, rapidly urbanizing continent of the world, and it has its own challenges and its own skill sets, and of course the local and regional governments, just like national governments, are also now trying to face the challenge. And I was aware that Mayor Manuel Araujo was joining us, but there may be some technical issues. Until we are able to connect to him, I would like to invite Megan Spires to share with us how ICLEI Africa is stepping up its efforts to serve African cities in responding to challenges of pandemic, but also connecting to the sustainability efforts. Megan, the floor is yours, and thanks a lot for joining us, and congratulations for your leadership in the region as well.
Thank you, Yunus, and thanks so much to all the participants that have shared before I've got this opportunity. And I think there's so much we can learn from New York and from Bonn. I just wanted to highlight in terms of Africa and African cities that ICLEI serves, that we really are just beginning to grapple with the COVID-19 crisis and the pandemic. At the moment, our statistics stand on 35,000 cases and just over 1,500 deaths. So if we compare that to what was shared in terms of just New York, we can understand that we're really only in the very beginning of trying to understand the implications of this virus on our continent. And I also want to stress and support what Shipra was sharing, just in terms of this, of course, being a health crisis, but also very much an economic crisis and a social crisis. And we've seen very swift action across Africa in dealing with COVID. Many of our countries are under quite severe lockdowns, like the country I'm from, South Africa. We're in our 5th week now of severe lockdown with very limited movements allowed. And this has had quite severe economic and social impacts on our people. We're hearing things like 30% of South African people are struggling to get hold of food during this lockdown period. And we know that these ramifications are being felt elsewhere on the continent. So I think that's an important point to make, that this is both a social, economic and a health crisis that we're facing. I also want to say that we've been thinking about the different challenges that are particularly pertinent on the African continent. one of which is our struggle with service delivery and access to things like health and sanitation, and the real struggles that those living in informal settlements have in terms of being able to wash their hands regularly, of being able to practice social distancing when they live in high densities. And I think that's an important discussion we should all be having, is around density as a response, both from a sustainability perspective, but also in terms of health pandemics. And then also healthcare backlogs. And this is probably why we've seen such swift response from many African countries in terms of dealing with these healthcare backlogs. I am just seeing that Eunice is showing that Maharajah might be able to speak after me, so I'll keep my input particularly short because I'd love to hear from the Mayor. I just wanted to highlight that the positives or the strengths we've seen on the African continent have been very strong leadership. And we must acknowledge that leadership, particularly from our president here in South Africa, who's also the chair of the African Union, President Rama. And I want to say we've also learned very much in terms of what we did to deal with HIV/AIDS on the continent, what we did to deal with tuberculosis on the continent, and that really allowed us to speed up our response in many countries. For instance, in South Africa, because we had systems in place that we used to deal with tuberculosis, for instance, to do tracking and tracing and testing, that we've been able to harness in our response to this pandemic and allowed us to respond more quickly. My last point would be to say that we've, at ICLEI Africa, been very focused on trying to ensure that intermediate and smaller cities on the African continent are receiving the information that they need and the support that they need. And this is an issue not only in terms of accessing that information, but then how do we deal with data shortages and the fact that many of our city stakeholders are working from home, often off mobile phones, and a lot of the resources being provided are high data users, and they're predominantly in English. So we really have been trying to tackle these two issues. And that is why we're looking into low cost or no cost data solutions that are relevant to African cities. And we'll be running a series of webinars that we hope to be low and no data solutions so that these smaller cities can access this type of information. We also want to say that what we've been speaking about for years around good governance, improved collaboration, relationship building, sharing on platforms that ICLEI and UN Habitat and others have created as being vital during crises. So if there are these relationships and good governance built up and systems in place and data that is being gathered, when crises hit, these things can be unleashed on scale. And so all the work that we've been doing in the past, I think, has had benefits. And now it's really about saying, what is the future for African cities? Please let's rebuild and recover in more equitable, more sustainable ways. And how can ICLEI Africa support that on the continent? So with that, I'll hand over to Maharajah. Good to see you, sir.
Thank you, Megan. We will have an interesting innovation here. So Mayor Aroho is connected by my WhatsApp account. I'm not sure whether, are you able to hear me, Mayor Aroho?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, maybe our participants are also hearing you. You are now connected to the webinar. We have around 500 participants. They are listening to you through my microphone and they are seeing you through my screen. We are connected to the world. And if you can ask your experience, I mean, you have gone through the floods in Mozambique, you have been champion of bikes, and soon we will also face the pandemic, but you are never giving up on your efforts on sustainability. So how do you connect these dots, and what do you expect, and what is your message?
Oh, thank you very much, Yunus, for being there for me, because I was following the whole webinar, and then when you called Shipra, I got caught up. I mean, these are the challenges that we face in Africa. As you well mentioned, last year, Mozambique was hit by two big cyclones, Idai and Kennedy. But also, we are now facing this crisis, the COVID-19. And the biggest challenge that we have in Mozambique, it's about, as you may imagine, about resources, both human and financial. Like one of the figures that really shows the extent of challenge that Mozambique is facing is the fact that we are able, Mozambique has got only one laboratory with the capacity for making tests. And that laboratory can only process a maximum of 100 tests a day. So since COVID started, so far Mozambique was able of identifying of 76 positive cases out of 28 million people. So far, 11,469 people has been already in quarantine, and 1,772 were being tested. As you can see, there is a huge effort that needs to be done so that we can have the real picture, because with only 1,000 tests carried out, we don't have the real extent of the infection in our country. Mozambique, as I mentioned, we have about 28 million people. So out of that, less than 2,000 have been tested. So this shows the extent of challenge that we do have. And we are also preparing local people to implement the emergency measures that have been declared in the country. And one of the biggest challenges we have is the issue of mobility. And as you mentioned, Kilimani City, with about 400,000 people, is the banking capital of Mozambique. At the beginning of this crisis, the president of Mozambique declared a state of emergency, which included the ban of cycling in the whole country. But after 2 weeks, the government had to retreat, because that is like the only way that the people and goods could be moved around, for example, in my city. And we were already seeing people protesting in the streets, burning tires and so on. So under that pressure, the government is to retreat some measures, which of course will represent a big challenge, because those people which were supposed to be at home, because they don't have the resources to keep themselves at home, they are obliged to go outside and keep their ends met. So this is the challenge of a poverty-stricken country, where on one side, there are measures that needed, like social distancing, needs to be enforced, but on the other side, there are no conditions for people to stay at home. So how do you solve that? That's what we're doing. That's what we are trying to do. And today, the head of the state will make an announcement, because the first 30 days of state of emergency ends today. But as we see, I think it will be extended for another 30 days.
Thank you. Actually, first of all, thanks a lot in reaching us in this challenging times in the last day of your curfew or lockdown. And I can refer to the for example, our Ph.D. in their Backlogs of using the public service #1 and a new generation of multilateralism and governance, which is a plethora of options definitely resonating in your cities. We have seen the same messages from New York, same messages from Bonn. The fact that we should be able to serve our citizens is much more proactive. Was mentioned about digitalization, where we're now hearing you and connecting you to a mobile device, which is giving us some interesting opportunity that we should embark on. And UN system was saying that I am trying to reach to the world's cities and regions through partnerships, through resources, through new channels of economic opportunities, so that in fact we are a big family. We have to connect better, we have to act faster, we can build better, much more sustainability offering to our citizens and the world. Maybe I can disconnect you because I'm trying to now close off our webinar the last 2 or 3 minutes, but I thank you a lot for your commitment to sustainability, your leadership, and we will continue to collaborate with you in Africa, in Mozambique, and globally. And thanks a lot. So Victoria, I think we are now really getting to the last seconds of our webinar because we are over the limit. I would like to, first of all, thank all the panelists and the partner organizations, New York City Mayor's Office and Local 2030 and UN Habitat in this webinar. I think it was really a very clear picture globally. We are in the making of our future, but we have to be better building in our history. We have to learn from our experiences, sometimes mistakes, but also capture the good experiences we had. In particular, over these decades, ICLEI has been challenging or championing the principles of sustainability, that it is now time to emphasize the pathways to sustainability much more closer and much more stronger. I'd like to just recall that this was a series of webinars, and this is the second webinar. The first one we had was with Milan and Quito. The resident city officers, city residence officers of Milan and Quito was with us. And on the 14th of May, we will connect to UN Disaster Risk Reduction, another UN sister organization, in terms of the Sendai framework and how it serves to these challenges, which will be more or less when we are hopefully getting out of this first phase of Corona, but especially coming into a new phase of building our cities and the countries in a much better way. So this webinar experiences, I think, will be a lessons learned for us. We will capture this together. You may recall that ICLEI has compiled all its own resources, the tools, the blogs, those webinars, as well as partners like Metropolis, C40, UCLG, that in our ICLEI COVID-19 resources homepage, you can find access to those documents. You can also access to the webinar recording, and we will share with our colleagues the links to their documents that they refer to. I have a list of questions like, especially changing lifestyles, the leadership, political leadership in changing the perceptions, which definitely goes through ambitious, passionate leaders. And I think we have plenty of them. We just have to empower them. We have to make them much more skilled and networked. So with this, maybe the last announcement I can have is our ICLEI's response to this process, which started with this webinar series as a part of the Residencies Congress. But since the beginning of this year, we have elevated this residencies concept in combination with the response to climate emergency, which is the realities of today. That was before the pandemic started. But under the new conditions, we have turned our daring cities, the urban response to the climate emergency, into a new format of virtual connections, but also a networking through the UNFCCC meetings in Bonn in October. So stay tuned. On Monday, you will hear new updates about how we will roll out the daring cities. And we would like to show that the cities are not retreating from their efforts. The citizens should be hopeful that they have their leaders connected and part of these efforts, and they should urge and ask their leaders to be part of this global effort. They should be helping their efforts, their administrations, but also they have to ask their leaders globally and nationally to have much more collaboration with their local and regional governments. And at the end of the day, it is the skilled citizens, it is the wise citizens that should make the changes real. And in that sense, ICLEI, New York City, UN Secretary General's Office, UN Habitat, ICLEI's global networks will be all ready for you to support you. With this, I'd like to apologize. I'm not able to give you a last words of response, but we will definitely be in touch. We'll share with you the questions, and then we will continue to serve our cities and also implement better. So with this, I'd like to thank you all. A good day, a good night. Stay safe, stay well, and would like to thank all our pioneers in the front line in their efforts. And once again, because of your efforts, we are able to develop such services to our world's citizens and partners. Thank you very much, and especially to ICLEI teams, Residencies team, knowledge management, who made this technically also this service possible. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.